Let's go ahead and get started. Everybody hear me okay in the back, front, middle, all that? Okay, perfect. So this is a workshop, so it'll be a bit more informal than some of the sessions that you'll see tomorrow. So if you want to have any fluid dialogue along the way, feel free to ask questions. We're basically going to divide this up into two parts. So the first, we'll do I'll do a workshop portion of it, a presentation, and then we'll have some folks jump up on stage, probably for about a half hour or so of Q&A. And I'll make those introductions once we get closer to the panel there. I don't know if I actually have a bio slide in here. Usually we always do in the sessions, but the workshops, as I said, are a little more informal. So let me just talk briefly about my background. So as an analyst at ARC, I'm responsible for the company in terms of analytics, things like artificial intelligence and its subsets around machine learning. My background, and the reason why I'm giving this workshop, is I've done a lot of consulting around strategy. Strategy from go-to-market aspects all the way up to business strategy around things like acquisition, pricing models, those types of things. What I want to do is tell you that we're going to get into some detail here, but there is a follow-along report that you can access, and you can get it through the app. Here are the instructions for that. Or if you have any issues or you read it and you want to yell at me or whatever, shoot me an email, come find me this week, whatever works for you. But it is in the report section of the ARC app. So what I'd like to do is start with a definition ARC had put together around digital transformation. And I want to just pull out a couple aspects here, because I think in digital transformation it's so easy to get caught up in certain aspects of it. And it's pretty easy to forget, what do you see the most there? We get caught up in things around sensors, data, and analytics and automation. But if you look at it, it's really about the augmentation of people and knowledge. And that's really forgotten a lot. Yes, I will not be one to just smooth over the idea that as we use a lot of this digital technology, we can do more with fewer people. There's that aspect of it, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you anything differently. But the one thing about it is that people will become augmented. So that knowledge that was tribal for so long will have an outlet. And I have an entire another concept and presentation workshop I do around workforce maturity. And one of the points I make around workforce maturity, because I've seen industries go digital before, is that you really fundamentally change what people are capable of, and capable of constantly. So it's not that they may have had a skill, they've honed that craft for 25 years, they're capable of it, but now you can realize the value of that capability a lot more often. And you can spread the value of that ability across your enterprise like you never could before. And that's, I think, is one of the things that's really overlooked, is to understand that it's about people. And if you don't consider people during the planning process, you're not going to get the outcome you expect. You just won't. And we'll walk through that here a little bit. So I want to do, again, this is kind of informal. If you want to hide your badge so you don't say who your company is, I want to see just a show of hands. How many people here have an organization that has some formalized strategic plan around digital transformation? Okay, not bad. I'm going to ask that same question a little differently. How many people have a very high level of confidence in that plan and the ability of the organization as currently presented to carry that plan out? Far fewer, yeah. So you kind of see where I'm going with this, and that's okay. We're doing transformational things, and it should be expected that there's there's a big gap between your vision and what you are capable of achieving. But you got to figure out a way to bring those two together. So that's what we'll work through today. I want to ask people, just a show of hands, how many people think their organizations have a really good handle on the role of people within digital transformation? You know, the skills, the alignment of capabilities, positioning them to succeed, you know, in terms of what your vision is. Raise your hands if you think you've got that covered. Yeah, you don't need machine learning to see where this is going. So I think these are some really critical things, because you can't solve a lot of the people aspects in tactical execution. It's just too late. You know, you've missed that boat because you don't have your people aligned the way you need to have them aligned. So you really want to figure out how to do strategic planning beginning at the highest level of the organization, while also taking from those people at the highest level of the organization the ability to chase a bunch of shiny objects. And we'll talk about that as well. One other question. How many organizations really think that as part of their strategic plan, they really have it dialed in terms of how to scale their efforts? That's a nobody. And you know what? One of the things that you'll see is when that happens, people often want to point the finger at the technology provider. And it's common, and sometimes it's true. Don't get me wrong, it is sometimes true. But a lot of times that has to do with a flaw in the planning process, and we'll go over that today. So just a quick background, and what you're going to get here is a bit of a preview of what we'll talk about tomorrow in the keynote the Tuesday morning address. So, you know, one of the reasons we're here is the imperative of change. Disruptive technology, market innovation, multi-billion-dollar government investment, and typically a combination of all of those. And so what's occurring is that you're seeing this pressure that's being put on you. And it's not just being put on industries, but it's also being put on people and communities as well. And that's having an impact upstream into the industries that are in those communities or serve those communities or derive talent from those communities. So it's pretty clear that now more than ever, we're seeing an emphasis from people, you know, they're stopping the dipping their toe in the water aspect of digital transformation, and they're starting to say we have to have a plan. We have to have a vision, and we have to have a realistic way of carrying out that vision. So we're really seeing a transition point from, you know, folks saying we want to just test this stuff to folks saying we got to get on board. So I think this just backs up the raising of the hands. This is an amalgamation of ARC research, and there's some publicly available numbers too that are within a few percentage points of this. So 80% of industrial organizations are undertaking a digital transformation initiative, yet less than 11% are having sustainable success with those same initiatives. And as you go into the industries that tend to be more traditional in nature, that have had their processes locked in place for a lot longer, the numbers get worse. So, you know, you see there's a massive gap between the desire to succeed and the ability to do so. And from what I've observed, there's really three missteps that I see that are quite common, and they all do relate to the planning process and flaws in the planning process. So the first thing is people get overwhelmed by possibilities. And since they're overwhelmed by those possibilities, what do? They set off in the pursuit of technology. And that's what digital transformation becomes. And then there's the elephant in the room, the thing that nobody wants to deal with, which are the organizational barriers, the cultural impediments. Because, you know, you think digital transformation's hard, organizational barriers, as everybody here knows, that's people change. That's incredibly difficult to do. So people just don't bother with it, or they try to go around it. So let's look at each one of those a little bit. So what you want to do is start with some of the outcomes around digital transformation, and walk your way back into how these impediments pop up. So this is the ARC view. These are outcome-based views of digital transformation. And this is really where the problem begins, because you start to get into the possibilities. So you see the potential for change across all of the value chains associated with these areas. And you start to get an idea of how massive digital transformation can be. Where it really comes into the front is the idea that you have a lot of dependencies associated with these outcome areas. And you have a lot of downstream and you have a lot of upstream. And digital transformation is because of it's disruptive in nature, you can have hiccups across that value chain. And instead of being unidirectional from upstream to downstream, it can be like a continuous stream. So you can be impacted in ways that you never anticipated. And it can happen all the time. And that's the whole idea of future-proofing. How do I manage what I can't see? So people think, oh, okay, I've got to get a handle on this. I've got to start to figure out what this means and how I can future-proof my business, how I can stay competitive. And and digital transformation, in terms of a capability, it's really just that. It's the idea of how do I react to real-time signals in the market in a way that's very beneficial to my business. That's a very different orientation, because it's all about speed of decision-making, not risk management, which is traditionally how industries have been aligned in terms of what they're trying to manage. So, when you look at digital transformation, it's not a static endeavor. It's not the idea of going from, paper to paperless. That's just becoming digital. It's really about what do you do with that process? What do you do with those efficiencies you gain? And it isn't a static thing where you say, we've done it, now we're done with it. That's not how it's oriented at all. So what you'll see here is just a list of, random possibilities. Some are challenges, some are opportunities, some are a little mix of both. I could have put together 100 slides of these and maybe just tap the surface. You could probably do 1,000 slides per, subset of, a plant or a supply chain. They're endless in terms of all the different things that you can do. So a lot of folks see these and they go, okay, I can understand them, but they're really difficult. They're still really difficult, but at least I can understand them. And then some folks are in the position of saying, I can't even foresee these things. They're so far away from me in terms of, what does it really mean to change my entire business model and the associated revenue and how I'm going to get my people to go out and maintain or grow that revenue. I can't even think about that. And so they just simply get overwhelmed. And so what do? They do what people naturally do. They say, I have no idea what I should do, why I should do it, or when I should do it. So off they go. Let me think about this in terms of technology. And this is where it starts to go off the rails. Because if you look at the amount of marketing hype out there, you look at the amount of the solution paths you can take. You can solve a problem today. You can taking a digital means to solve a problem, you could solve it 10 different ways. And there's no right or wrong. It's just the way you need to solve it. The only right or wrong is in the context of, is it the right way for your business? So you have all these people throwing all this marketing hype at you and all these different solution pathways. And what happens is you find people become very quickly unable to compare vendors in meaningful ways. So am I looking at apples to apples, apples to oranges, or apples to spaceships? And in that apples to spaceships thing, I mean, that's a true comparisons. Some of these things are so different, yet they're attacking some of the same business needs. And it's just really confusing. So what people do, I think, it's a pretty natural progression. You're confused by the possibilities. You try to make it about technology. And then you say, okay, let me figure out a way to try to get some means of comparing these technologies. And one of the things that I find very interesting about digital transformation is it is one of maybe a handful of instances that you've seen across the arc of business where you're specifically asking people to manage and understand things outside of their areas of expertise. So you're asking operations folks to have very deep understandings of the differences of white box versus black box algorithms. Or, to have business leaders being able to make decisions around things and understand things that you'd normally not ask them to do. And then you compound it, and I'm not talking to you people out here, but businesses in general, of course. So you compound it by asking them to not only understand those technologies, but also understand the impact of those technologies within their areas of expertise and responsibility. And that, I think, it's simply a bridge too far. And sometimes they'll say, I can't do that, therefore I need a group to go do that for me in my company. But then they lose the context. They separate the subject matter experts from the technology experts. And so they have that disconnect. So they do what I think people naturally do. They go, I got to wrap my head around this as a starting point. So I'm going to look at digital transformation in terms of technology, and I'm going to focus on some capabilities because I think I can wrap my head around that, because I'm starting to try to pull it into areas I can understand into my operations. But I'm going to think about, I'm using analytics here as an example, and I will for the rest of this presentation here, because it's very common. It's a starting point, I think, for most all organizations in terms of what they want to do. So they're looking at things like techniques. How do I know if I should use enhanced SPC or deep learning? What's the difference in terms of my situation? Users. I can't stop this plane to build it while it's flying. I can't do that. So what's the user experience like? Who's involved in this? What do I need in terms of my resources to be able to make this work? Tools. So is this designed for my engineer, or is this designed for my IT folks, or both? What tools do they have to use? How do I put more data into this? How do I use some of the intellectual property I already have? And then deployments. That's key, right? Because I've heard all this stuff about the cloud and infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, software as a service. I can't do that because I got to do it in my plant floor. I got to do it in the plant. They won't let me do it anywhere else because of governance. So what does that mean? How does that get done? So you've got all these people trying to figure out ways to define digital transformation around these capabilities. And it simply doesn't work. There's just a lot of confusion. And inevitably, typically we see a lot of people end up in the, I don't know. So I need some help. I need to figure out how to get out of this technology comparison because it's not working for me. So one of the things that we see, if they can get off this hamster wheel of technology comparison, there's a eureka moment. And I am actually finding more and more vendors are leading their clients to this eureka moment. And it's the idea of, oh yeah, well, it's the business need, of course. If we can focus on the business need, we can get away from this technology comparison. And it is a step in the right direction, clearly, because it does start to focus you more on what problems you're trying to solve. But the challenge around the business need is it still has some fundamental flaws. People look at the business need, they have that eureka moment, and so what they do is they start to pour a ton of resources, a ton of money, a ton of effort into the business need, because the business need is going to serve two things for them. It's going to give them a way to manage digital transformation, but it's also the idea is that it's going to lead them to a pathway for scalability, because it's focused on the business itself. And it's a pretty logical step. And it is a step in the right direction, but again, it does have some flaws. So the business need, what it does is it gives them the definition. Now I can use the business need to say, I understand what digital transformation means to me, and I understand it within the context of my organization. And then what I'll do is I'll use that as a filter of sorts. So I can start to understand, okay, here's the data involved, the people involved, the processes involved, the technology involved, the customers, whatever your filters are. And the idea is that there's going to be some sort of deployment, and that's going to be a method for scalability. It's going to be the crawl, walk, run approach around the business need. The idea is pretty logical. If I've got a business need, I can define what's involved in it, I can solve it, I'm then going to go start to look for other instances of that business need around the company, or things that are fairly similar to it. And I will apply that same approach, and off we go. There I have scalability. And it doesn't even have to be the exact same approach, but something fairly similar. And again, this makes a ton of sense until this next thing happens. So you start out all excited, and you say, all right, let's do it. And inevitably, and I'm sure you guys have all experienced this, inevitably you run up against something, right? You run into some kind of cultural, organizational barrier. That data, we're not really, that unstructured stuff, it's really, no, we're not going to deal with it. Well, we're going to set that aside for the minute, right? Those guys suck. I can't stand working with them. Don't tell them what we're doing, because they'll try to shut it down or they'll try to take it over. So we just can't go down that road. Or you have, that seems pretty ambitious. Let's dial it back. You know, we were going to do this class of assets. Let's just do those 4 assets over in that plant over there, because it's a good plant. We got good data. We got good people. We can do that. No problem. Or, oh, man, you know, we wanted to do that analytics. We met that vendor. They were great. They were going to do world of good for us. We can't support that from an IT perspective. So what else can we do? And that's inevitably what happens in some way, shape, or form. Maybe some of it, maybe all of it, maybe different problems. But what happens is digital transformation then takes on a new shape. You've got 2 pillars there. You still have the pillar of the business need, which is good, the problem you got to solve, but you've artificially injected another pillar, and that's called manageability. So yeah, there's a business need, and I know I can manage this. I'm pretty sure I've gotten it to the point where I'm going to be able to take this on, and I'm going to be able to solve this problem. So it becomes about manageable business needs. And that's not transformation, that's incremental change. And that's the big difference. So when you're unwilling to confront cultural barriers, that's what happens. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't throw stones or anything. The business need is incredibly important. I will say it again, so you can't say that I didn't. The business need is incredibly important. But what we're finding right now is it's coming way too soon in the planning process. And that's an elemental flaw in the process itself, because you put artificial limits on what's possible, because you're unwilling to confront those cultural barriers. So one of the things that you'll see is as the potential for disruption, as it increases. So you can deal with it now if you're just dealing with a certain type of technology or process disruption or a different way of doing things. It may seem like it's okay. You can manage that need. You can get some benefit out of it. But as you add more and more and more and more, it just starts to break apart. It starts to fall apart. So what you have to do is find what I call some connective tissue between strategy and the granular details of tactical execution of digital initiatives. And that's what's missing. That's why the hand raising slowly went down, because that's what you've got to do to bridge that particular gap. When you do that, you end up with adherence to a business strategy, an objective, and you have adherence at all levels of the organization, top to bottom and back again. And what that gives you is a means for prioritizing what should be done. So if we know what our objectives are, and there's an understanding at all levels of the organization, we'll have a much easier way of prioritizing what we should do. And then when you have that, you have rationale for decision making. And then you have authority, or you should have authority for making those decisions, because they'll seem like they make much more sense in the context of what the business is trying to achieve. And then you also will have a much crisper understanding of the roles of people, not just the impact of digital transformation, but what their responsibilities are, and most importantly, the value they derive from change as it occurs, because that's incredibly important. Because if people don't perceive value in the change, they're not going to do it. And then also what you do, and we'll talk about it a little bit here, is you give to your leadership a means of avoiding the shiny object. So there's a real understanding at the executive level of the realities of the organization. So it's not one of those, hey, I want to do predictive maintenance because I talked to Joe and he's got this great new company he started. Because that's just is not helpful. And you got to figure out a way to really cut that type of thinking off. But you've got to do it in a way that demonstrates it as a business strategy imperative, not my people just can't do this decision. So that's what you got to get away from. So we've got a 3-step process, and that's what I'm going to walk through today for dealing with that. Let me just catch up here for a second. One of the things that you'll see in this 3-step process, the thing that nobody wants to do is step 1. That's the one everybody wants to avoid. And the reason being is that's where all the cultural barriers are surfaced. And they tend to get glossed over. So it's imperative that you start with this step. And step 1 is really, that's where the assessment of the organization's appetite for change comes in. So, what's our capacity for change? What resources do we need to actually transform? So it's a really hard look in the mirror stage. And then when you've got that in place, you really have you've got the beginnings of a framework of things that are defined in terms of digital transformation. We understand what is possible. And we understand what we have to do if we want to get to our end goal. And that really sets you off in a direction that everybody can organize around. So step 2, I think, step 1 is the one that's avoided. Step 2 is probably the one where people struggle the most. They do it, or some form of it, but they do it without step 1. And I think this is where we start to see a lot of people that are trying to take this step on in terms of saying, I'm going to come up with some kind of data strategy. So that's what step 2 looks like a lot. People saying, it's the data, right? Because digital transformation is all about the data. So if I can figure out some type of strategy around my data, then that'll give me some type of framework for what I can do. And inevitably they may end up creating a data lake. And it may be a data lake that is suitable for endeavors that they want to do, not just immediately, but down the road. But again, they haven't assessed the organization. They haven't given themselves a way to really align their strategic objectives with what's going to be done with that data lake. So it then becomes, again, a series of use cases. So step 3, I think, is done quite a bit, and it's the most, it's the most prevalent output you'll see from people, because it's pilots. People saying, well, let's test the waters. The difference being is there's one thing with digital technologies that you do kind of want to see what they can do sometimes. So giving people sets of data or some type of little execution to understand, get a fundamental education, that's a good thing. But what I'm talking about here is really the idea of pilots that are the stepping stone to scale. And so a lot of companies get into this and they really struggle because it doesn't work for them. Again, because they haven't done step 2 and they haven't done step 1. Where you see with step 3 is you just see some of these pilots that kind of get what I call left out on an island, where somebody will say, yeah, we did that, there was no ROI. That's pretty common. So looking at this process a little more deeply, as you'll see, there's a very specific purpose, goal, and folks involved in these. And again, that's to bring the continuity into it, to bring a very methodical way for walking the strategy downstairs in a way that's informed and realistic. The step 1, the purpose here is really to look at how reality informs strategy. That's the best way I can say it. That's for your C-suite. That's for your senior executives. Because often they figure out, if I can just crack the whip a little harder, things will work. But digital transformation, in many instances, that's not going to happen. So you've got to give them a way to look at it as well, and that's very realistic in terms of what's possible. That's what I call the appetite for change. And that is just the assessment is more a picture. What can we do? What can't we do? Realistically, what do we look like? What are our strengths and weaknesses? This is the funny thing is this is kind of common with traditional strategic planning. This happens almost every year, every couple years, whatever your 3 or 5 year plans are. But for some reason, people don't want to do this with digital transformation in mind, and that baffles me a little bit. And I think that's where they just it's like a caffeinated squirrel. Ooh, technology. Ooh, technology. Let me just chase it. Let's see what that does for me. But you really got to it's really got to start with your executives. And if they, there's a lot of enthusiasm and buy-in and expectation with executives around digital transformation, but they have to understand it really starts with them them knowing what it is that we have to work with as an organization. So step 2, this is again the connective tissue piece that I talk about, connecting that strategy to business need. So step 2 is where the business need comes in. And it starts to set the tone for what's going to be done, but it's going to be done in a way that's prioritized relative to what the organization is capable of doing. And that's going to give them even more granular direction. You're going to go farther down the filter. And then step 3, again, is the execution. How do we make sure that this stuff gets carried out in the way it needs to be carried out? And what you'll see is as you walk through that process, you've got continuity, you've got alignment. You have the ability to, go downstairs, so to speak, and say, well, we're doing this because. And you have the ability to go upstairs and say, we're having a hard time achieving this because. And much more specific, rational decisions can be made around, okay, with those things in mind, let's do this. So you just get better alignment across the entire process. So let's start with phase 1. And this is really the assessment where you identify the gaps. And again, this is I want to make the point, this is sustainable change. Because you can cut out a pilot and you can do something around your assets, for example, and it can look really good. That may or may not be sustainable. What happens if that vendor goes away? What happens if the people on the team go away? You're still left with incremental change because you really didn't truly transform what you were trying to do. So here, this is again the view of reality that will occur in the assessment. This is the hard look in the mirror that you want to start with as an organization. And you're really working through three things relative to what you're assessing. So it's the culture of innovation. And this is really about the organization's willingness to change. And I mean true willingness to change. Not just words. It's a look at maybe a group within your company and say, those guys haven't changed in decades. What makes us think they're going to change now? And at least having that understanding and being able to deal with it. And then there's the state of things and processes, which really reflects the scope of change required. This does get into things like, it does talk about, get into things like people, but it also would talk about things like, how much do I have in there that's green versus brown in terms of what I have to change? What does my infrastructure look like? How weak is it in areas? How strong is it in areas? What are my partners' ecosystem? All that stuff. What does that look like? And then organizational expertise. And this one's pretty interesting because it's very fluid. What you're likely to need up front is very different from what you're likely to need as you go through levels of maturity in terms of transformation. So do keep that in mind. But typically, if you're able to really work through some of the initial people changes, it will start to become more self-evident as you go along. You'll start to see possibilities of what, I never could consider these people could do this before. But now I'm getting pretty comfortable that we can do this. So let's shift what we ask them to do in terms of their competencies, skills, and what they're measured against, for example. And without this assessment, that's what you're going to have. And that organizational gap is just a disconnect, in the reality of what operations deals with every single day and what the C-suite thinks. Because the C-suite is by nature vision-driven, and the operations by nature is daily operations-driven. And you got to bring those together. And that's what that first phase, that assessment will do for you. So when ARC looks at the model that we've produced around this phase, here's how we define it. We separate this into people and business processes, and we have 6 areas. Now, what you'll see here from an explanation standpoint, and again, with that paper that I mentioned, there's a lot more detail around this. But we have definitions of what the maturity looks like on a level 1 to 5, and you'll see the level 5 definitions there. Now, I'm not going to suggest that this is dialed in for everybody, every single organization, but it's a framework that looks similar to this. So you would have some tweaks, of course, based on how you may approach things, disciplines and philosophies that you may have as an organization. But it really outlines that there are people involved and there are business processes involved. And it doesn't mean that each one of these has to mature at the same pace. And there will be dependencies among these things. But you have to start to consider, some things that pop out for me around the first 3 on the people side are fascinating to me. Because if you're able to mature teamwork and culture, knowledge transfer, capabilities and competencies, you can solve so many problems because you've got people headed in the right direction. But if you don't define what those things mean to you in terms of digital transformation, in terms of common definitions of what digital transformation can bring to you as an organization, you're not going to get anywhere with it. You're just going to be spinning your wheels, or you're going to be looking at, hey, we tried to change this group over here and it didn't really work. So this is where the organization can start to build a vision for what it wants to achieve relative to a maturation process And it can start with the idea that it's okay if I can move 2 steps forward and I got to move 1 step back, because I have an overall idea of what it is I'm trying to achieve relative to how I measure my workforce performance, or how I look at architecture and governance. Maybe I can't do something until I change my governance. Maybe I can't do something, around what I want to do for knowledge transfer. Maybe I can't tap into that tribal knowledge that I wanted to tap into because I put such restrictions around governance of sharing. So it's surfacing those things and saying, okay, I'm aware of that now. I understand that. And digital transformation is trying to, with knowledge transfer, one of the ideas of it is how you extract tribal knowledge and how you take all that expertise, and instead of making it an individual thing, you make it organizational. You take the capacity of somebody to walk around a plant and hear things and see things and tell you what that means, and you digitize it. So 10 people can do that have half the experience. But if you set such restrictions around governance of sharing, you can't do that. And it doesn't mean that that's wrong. It doesn't mean your governance is wrong, but it means you have to have an assessment of that to understand it, to say, am I willing to change that? Because if you're not willing to change that, then maybe you don't head down that direction in terms of a digital solution. So the output of phase one, that's what I think is really what you're going to have, is a common understanding of digital transformation specific to your business. So you'll have organization-specific context, and it'll be based on common ideas and definitions of digital transformation, because it becomes much easier to look at the concepts of digital transformation, say, now I know how that may apply to my organization and my organization's ability to do something around data, for example. I know what I look like. I know what somebody tells me can be done with data, and I know the two are not in line. Or maybe they are. But you can really start to see digital transformation specific to the context of your company. And then most importantly, the impediments. Those barriers I talked about. You start to surface them. You start to have an idea of, there are 5 things that are really preventing us from doing this. And 3 of them are so hardwired, we really have to work on them, and they're going to be tough. These other 2 we think we can do. And because we think we can do them more quickly, we can actually make some advancements in those areas that we didn't really anticipate. And then expectations. So this is really more for your C-suite. So this is setting expectations of what is possible. So you're not trying to ask operations folks to do things that they really aren't well positioned to do yet. Because if not, they're just experimenting and seeing what they come back with. And that, again, that's incremental change, not transformational change. And then also you have to have a means for prioritizing initiatives, any kind of digital initiatives. But what you want to do is prioritize those initiatives in terms of what's possible, what your organization is capable of, not what you think you might want to do. Or, yeah, we've heard that, predictive maintenance, if we can do that, we can get all sorts of gains from doing that. Well, if you don't have any of the data that you're going to need to feed that beast, it's not going to work for you. So maybe deprioritize that and work on some of the mechanisms that will help feed the engine, so you can do that analysis that you really want to, so you can then change the people and how they do maintenance. So it's really just working through possibilities based on what you're capable of doing. So this is an initial assessment that you come out with. And I'm not going to suggest that there's a perfect cadence for doing this, because I think a lot of it, I would take this cadence and I would look at it in terms of a typical strategic planning process. Whatever your rhythm is for strategic planning, you probably want to do this in a similar cadence. And once you start to understand things, then you can either slow it down or speed it up based on what you think works for you. Because you don't want this assessment to be static. With anything digital, I don't think you want it to be static, because this is not meant to. This is meant to inform your playbook, not just initially, but 6 months down the road, 3 years down the road, whatever your vision ends up being, because it will change, of course. And you don't want to just have it sit on the shelf and take it out and say, okay, yeah, we assessed ourselves and off we go. You really want to make this an active process of your planning. What that'll do for you is really, it's going to, where you see particular value is in scope creep. Any kind of initiative, you eventually have to guard against scope creep. And the assessment and the framework of the assessment is able to really put some, contain that. And also it's a great, with digital transformation, one of the things we see is when people are able to do it well, there is always, 10 or 20 aha moments that come out of that, where they go, oh my God, we were able to do this. Now we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. And it just, as it should, it just starts to flow. The idea, the possibilities start to flow. So you want a really good way of having a red light, green light, filter in place. And that's what you can do here with this assessment. You can say, well, that would be great, but we're not ready for that yet because we got to solve this other problem over here because it's high priority. And you'll start to see where that'll, in phase 2, you'll start to see where that really pops up. So phase 2, this is really about defining action paths. So this is where you step back from the mirror and you can say, okay, yeah, that was kind of harsh, but at least I know where I stand now. So let's figure out what we're actually going to do. Let's move forward. And this is all about setting direction. The difference is now that direction is really informed by your strengths and your weaknesses. So you really understand what you're capable of and what you don't want to deal with yet, because though it may be beneficial, you're just not ready to do it. The best way I can say is this is the phase that makes sure you don't do that tried and true phase of trying to put a square peg in a round hole in phase 2. So you have this completed assessment, and now you want to start to look at the action paths. Again, you've just gone down from the 50,000-foot view to the 25,000-foot view in terms of what you're doing with the information. You're informing this phase with phase 1 in the assessment. Because you're going to start to transition more towards operational realities, everyday work processes and procedures and people, you want to transition this phase to the leaders of those areas. So you transition away from the pure strategic planning process, which is usually senior executives, and more toward line of business, operational leaders who tend to have a view of both strategy and operations. What you may want to do also that I would recommend is do keep, typically when you go through the assessment, you're naturally going to define, or maybe you've hired somebody that's going to be your executive sponsor. Have that executive sponsor involved in this process, because that way you just ensure that you're always informing that person of, we said we wanted to do this, but remember when we identified this real big gap in our capability of doing so? So you can have that person constantly reminded of the operational realities as you get more and more granular. It's just a nice safety net to have. So this is, again, an example, and it's built more around analytics. It's generally applicable to, and you can tweak some of this stuff to suit your needs. But you're looking at some of the filters you'd use in this phase 2. So you're building a framework. So your framework has to have filters and definitions associated with it. So here you see these 8. So you've got change. What you're starting to do is you're asking much more specific questions about, we've prioritized 5 different things we want to achieve. We understand what our gaps are associated with the business and our ability to change. So now we want to start asking things like, what business need does this initiative address? So again, this is where you start to push the business need into the planning process. This is really where it's applicable. What market factors are driving this? Based on how the organization works currently, how will it operate in the future if this initiative is successful? That's something that a lot of folks don't ask. They'll say, I know what I will get out of this if I'm more efficient, or I'm able to have the uptime increase X. But what are you going to do with that? So start planning that into the process, because it's not just, again, it's not about getting the benefit and being static with it. It's about getting the benefit and saying, okay, now we move forward another step. So it's the continual change that you always want to put into your process. So metrics, pretty straightforward. So based on KPIs, how will you know if the initiative is successful? Sometimes it's pretty obvious. Sometimes it might not be with digital transformation, because there are ways that you can use some of these solutions to see things you've never seen before. So, how can you set a metric if you've never seen something before? So it's the idea of saying, how do we want to measure this? Give yourself a baseline, and then determine if you've actually met that baseline, or if that baseline needs to be readjusted along the way. Human resources, folks that get left out of this process a lot of digital transformation. So they're often assigned the tough task of hiring people, but they're not often that I see brought into the planning process around digital transformation. And that is short-sighted. And an example I've used before, and it's a simple example, but we'll come across many more, much more complex examples of this. When telecom and cable companies went from analog to digital, they undertook a fundamental shift that they didn't really anticipate, and they had to rewire. It took them about 5 years, many of them, rewire everything they thought about in terms of knowledge transfer. They had folks whose job it was to go and install cable or telephone services. And those people were really good at wiring up to a building and then wiring inside a building. And as they started to roll out advanced digital services, that didn't help all that much, because what those people needed to be were network experts. And if you look at somebody that comes into your home today with all your digital services, that's what they are, is a network expert. That is a fundamentally different job than wiring things. It has wiring in it, but it's far more advanced. And there are things about networking you can never know, because there's way too much complexity. So you have to arm those people with tools, decision tools. So you have to take a lot of that knowledge and you have to shove it into a tool. So you have to design an entire hiring process, competencies, skills, all of that around that transition. And if you don't have human resources involved, it's always going to be reactive, and you'll limit what you could do with a person because you didn't see it coming. And you do not want to make that mistake. So do get human resources involved. And data and security. This is probably the most obvious one. Entire track on cybersecurity today for a reason. So what's your data strategy? What security is necessary to maintain your data safety? And then what changes are necessary? Do you have to fundamentally rethink how you deal with data, governance of it, maintenance of it, security of it? And if so, how are you going to do that? Infrastructure. Is the existing infrastructure you're going to apply this to, will it support this improvement? If not, what needs to change? Is this an investment you're looking at? How big? If you determine that you want to do this and you want to do it at scale, what does that look like? Over what time period? Dependencies. This is something you'll start to see a lot, particularly when you've done an assessment, because you will start to realize that things, one thing affects the other. And this is the 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's a dependency there. So we can get a massive gain here, but we're going to fall back in this area. Or we can't do this over here until we improve this area. So you can identify that. And then solution path. So this would be at a high level, what technology or solution category would support this and why? I'm not talking about vendors. I'm not talking about functional capabilities. I'm talking about potential solution paths. Potential technologies that you've heard that solve these types of problems. What do they look like? Were there any that we considered before or that we've run into and that we've bypassed? Was that the correct decision? Why? Should we revisit them? Should we discard some of the things that we're doing? And then goals, I think. What overall strategic goal does this initiative contribute to and why? And then again, it links it to step one. It links it to those strategic objectives. So this is where you come up with your framework that's informed by your assessment. So the output, again, it ensures reality-informed strategy. It is really that simple. You have to have a way of doing that with digital transformation. So these are just some examples of conversations that you might have relative to the second phase. You can have a lot of cross-functional decisions around what you're doing and why. So are you looking at lagging processes, businesses or operational areas that you're saying, we really got to solve this problem because it's just holding us back massively? And maybe that is the data lake, as an example. But there's an understanding of that. There's a real arrow pointing at that, and people are all shaking their head, yep, that's the problem. You can bring in, this is a lot of times when you bring in your business development team, all your people that are doing your research on outside trends. What's going on with our competition? What do we see there? How do we put that into our filter around what we're trying to do? Trade-offs. How easy is this? How hard is this? In terms of 10 things we could prioritize, how important is that? So what you're starting to do is you're starting to get some consensus around what should be done and why. And again, it's informed by what is possible. And that's where you come up with your framework. So the output here is a map with rationale and agreement. So you're really able to look at what you've identified as possible and starting to understand how you've prioritized things. What filters have you put in place for why things are high priority? Because again, this is something I've dealt with a lot where just around strategic planning in general. You may want to consider things high priority. We always say, well, what's going to increase our revenue and lower our costs? Well, there's a lot that goes into that. And you may say, well, I'm not really as concerned about the revenue right now. I'm just really concerned about being able to do something for a customer a particular way. Because I think, based on what I know is going on in the industry, that will serve me well 3 years from now, as an example. So it really gives you a lot more fluidity in terms of how you can have conversations around priorities. And then this will be some type of documentation. You will have the assessment typically is a documentation of what the organization looks like. This framework is going to be a documentation based on, I gave you the example of the 8 pillars, where you have very specific rationale for what you've come up with and why. And then you can use this to get sign off by the C-suite. So they started it. They started it with the assessment, so they're the ones that put this first layer in, and you've just carried it forward, and you can bring it back to them and say, this is what we think. And they should understand a lot of what they're seeing because they helped create that vision for it, which is crucial. So with these first 2 phases complete, the organization, you've got your fundamental building blocks for a digital transformation roadmap here. And you've really begun to move toward very granular action. So now you've got a direction. Now you really want to step into the granularity of it. So you've got the output of here is you've discovered where change is possible, and you've discovered how capable you are of transforming. You've used that discovery to narrow your focus in terms of what will take place and why. And then you've also created an operational framework that gives you rationale for decision making about who's involved, when they're involved, why they're involved. So you start to answer some of those pretty fundamental questions around digital transformation. So again, sorry for the gray out there. There's some different IIoT technologies, focusing again on trying to keep some continuity here around analytics. This is really, phase 3 is focusing on execution. So this is really designing a pathway to pilot and deploy technologies to help solve a specific problem. And what you want to do is you want to create an execution plan that, again, accounts for all those barriers that limit proof of concept and scale. So you take out all those artificial constraints because you surface them and there's an understanding of how they're going to be dealt with. And this is, again, as well, your operational leadership that really ran phase 2 will start this process. You really want to turn this phase over to the team that will be managing a lot of that execution. And again, there's a transition that enables continuity in both of those phases around leadership. So this is when you will have, in phase 2, you will have defined who that cross-functional team should be, because you'll start to understand what competencies you want involved relative to the priorities you're trying to carry out. So we have here again, this ARC's process is it's 5 elements for piloting and scaling a digital transformation solution, and these are pretty common to a lot of complex deployments, so they shouldn't look all that new really. But what what we'll do again is they're defined in the context of digital transformation. So let's say that analytics, machine learning is your preferred technology as you've defined in the output of phase 2. You know that that's a solution path you want to go down because you believe it meets a lot of the criteria and the metrics of the objectives you want to achieve that you've developed in the framework in phase 2. But you're not talking about specific capabilities yet because you're not at that phase. This is where you'll start to get into that. And again, what this does is you've taken a business strategy and you've just pushed it all the way down to a tactical execution layer. So there's a lot of continuity in terms of the folks carrying it out have a really good understanding of, I know why we're doing this. So as you break down this phase a little bit more, you've really got these 5 components. And again, we're going to look at analytics as an example. So use cases. This is really where the business need starts to be defined in the terms of a use case. What needs to be solved, irrespective of the technology. And then the scope is really, it's identified to limit really unwarranted expansion. So this is where you can really make sure you don't get into scope creep, because you've got some very specific business objectives you're trying to achieve here. And it also starts to get into, this is the solution, and also we understand, how we'll justify the ROI of this particular investment. So for instance, if you've got a predictive analytics pilot, you could then very comfortably limit it to an asset within a plant or a class of rotating assets across multiple plants, or simply a test data set, because you have some very specific ideas of how strategically important the outcome of this pilot would be. And then you have information and expertise. So this is going to get in, as to who's involved in the actual pilot. So what skills and information are needed to not just execute the pilot, but if then the pilot, it's determined it will scale, what does that need to look like? Because the assumption is, well, we'll just do it and then we'll just keep doing it, and somehow magically everything we need around people will just appear. And that's not the case. So you really want to start to say, this is again, what will the organization look like if you're able to realize this benefit? What do you do with it? You start to change what you want people to do because you find far more beneficial things to do with their time and expertise. So this set of folks is if you're looking at analytics, this is where you're always going to have your experts from operations because they're the context people. They're the ones that can tell you what stuff means, so to speak. But you could also include system super users, data scientists, decision engineers, those types of folks, coders, for people who want to use a platform. You're going to need those types of skills. And this also, when you start to focus in on the resources you need, you then start to understand how disruptive these pilots might be in terms of existing job roles. So if we scope this out, what are we asking people to do and do differently, and how disruptive will this be? And this is, can they stop it's that whole idea that I can't build the plane while I'm flying it. Well, if that's what you're asking people to do, then land the plane. But have a rationale from a strategic level for saying that's okay. You have to have those hard decisions and a way for working through them. One of the things that we do find that I certainly have found around these projects is at this point, the experts, it's really pretty self-evident. You'll know when you get to this point, we want those 5 people involved in that department over there. It will become very clear to you because you've been very methodical in how you've worked through the process. So cost and budget. Now, the reason I put cost and budget up here is not because it's new or different. We have that for anything. But what you're going to have to start to consider with digital transformation, digital solutions, is maybe costs that you didn't anticipate, not just what something might cost, but when it might cost. So if you move to using technology as a subscription, for example, that's a different way of laying out that cash for that. And you may say, well, what's the nature of how we have to problem solve this? Can we access this solution, in certain ways? Can we use it to solve problems and then wind down that cost? Or is it consistent? Just things you didn't consider before because you really didn't have to. This is where you get into things like storage. If we're doing something, are we trying to do it out on the edge? Or are we going to always process that in the cloud, and what's the cost associated with the data there, and how are we going to keep that cost and down and make sure that data is secure? So just different things of cost that you might not have thought about. And then technology identification. So when you look at all the possibilities out there, what you have to do is figure out how you're going to identify technology with your organization in mind and push it out at the vendor, kind of force it on them. The difference in digital transformation technologies versus traditional systems is there has to be a lot more give and take in the conversation. So you want your questions out to them to be much more open-ended than you normally would ask them about. So it's, you tend to have systems where it's much more yes, no, how, yes, no, how. And you want to make sure you're incorporating things like, how would you approach something and why? And that will start to have you understand their capabilities in terms of what their vision is for their technology. And you can start to align that much more specifically with what you do. And then validation. So this is pretty common. This is really just making sure that everything all lines up in the end. Is really that there's an alignment check for that pilot, so you can go back and adjust any of these phases that you need to. And that you can also go back and make sure that it's a gut check against phase 2 and phase 1. So it's really just to add that in there. So the output here is really you've set that strategy into motion. So you've started with phase 1, you set it all the way into motion in phase 2, and then you've really started to execute it. And by doing so, you've created a digital transformation roadmap. So you formalize the strategic process. You have a very tactical understanding of what you're doing, why you're doing, when you're doing. You're ensuring that high priority objectives are executed. And you're injecting reality into what's possible. So you're informing your executives as to what can be done. You have real specificity for requirements gathering as you go out into a very crowded market. And you have agreements at all levels of the organization throughout the entire process. And then also, again, what I said, this is continuous change. So you've provided yourself an entryway into how people's roles and responsibilities might change, not only over the short term, but maybe over the long haul. And that's really what you want with digital transformation. So recommendations here. Figure out a way. Look in the mirror. Figure out a way to assess, avoid the square peg and round hole. Account for humans early in the process and often and always. If you're having trouble scaling and justifying ROI, you really want to rethink why. You really want to say, what is the problem there? And again, build mechanisms that confront decision-making through all three phases. Make sure you've got rationale for every decision you make. And then be willing to, this is transformation. Be willing to confront things that you never confronted before. Be okay with that. Doesn't mean you have to solve them immediately, but you may want to solve them. And then also, again, we'll have this meeting right after here, is just learn from not just people within your industry, but outside your industry as well. Digital transformation really applies well that way. We'll have a meeting here at 4 o'clock of the DTC, or Digital Transformation Council. So any of you end users want to stick around for that, that's something that you'll definitely see a lot of people sharing across industries. All right, so thank you very much for listening to me. And what I'd like to do is get the panel up here for about 15 minutes of Q&A.